Hello, everyone, and welcome to NCSL's webinar, Successfully Handing Off to Election Officials. My name is Wendy Underhill, and I will be moderating the webinar today. I'm the Director of the Elections and Redistricting Program here at NCSL. I'm excited about today's webinar because it is the capstone for a 12-part series on redistricting, and we could not have a better lineup of speakers today to put the cherry on top of this amazing few weeks we've had. The topic is all important also, and that is how is data handed from map makers to election officials, and what can states do on the redistricting side to make it easier on the election side. Before we get going, I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsors of this redistricting webinar series for their generous support of NCSL's work. If you would like more information on how to get in touch with any of these companies, please let us know in the audience chat box. As for what we'll be doing today, we have a 4-course menu. We'll start off with Charles Stewart. Many of you have probably met Charles before back in the old days when NCSL events were in-person events. He spent much of his career focusing on election administration and recently has begun working on geography and elections, which means adding redistricting to his portfolio. After that, we'll hear from Shelley April from the Maryland Department of Planning. While each state is unique in how it handles geographic data for elections, she'll describe her state's processes, how a bill leaves the legislature and eventually, many steps later, leads to assigning voters to new districts and running a good election. Basically, she's going to provide the state-level perspective. And then we'll get the local perspective from Tiffany Parker, the county clerk in La Plata County, Colorado. She has well over 2 decades of experience in multiple states on creating the precincts and local election districts. And so she gets the data after the state-level redistricting is complete. And finally, we're going to turn it back to Charles to wrap it up. Now for a few practicalities. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participants through our chat box to engage with each other, and I can see lots of people are doing that right now. Feel free to ask your questions there, and if you happen to have answers to other people's questions, throw them in there too. You might even tell us something about something unique that you know about how your state does redistricting, just something fun and a little different in there if you'd like to. Then above the presentation, you'll see a couple of tabs. One of those tabs is labeled Resources. There you can find a downloadable PDF of today's PowerPoint as well as some other handouts. And then the Speaker tab contains the bios of today's speakers. Lastly, today's webinar is being recorded, and a link to access the recording will be emailed to you within a week. And that's what I've got. Charles, are you ready to go?
I'm already unmuted and ready to go.
Okay, go for it.
Great. Thanks so much, Wendy, for starting us off. And I'm gonna say a few words of introduction to this session and then get quickly out of the way, because it seems to me that what we really want to do is hear from the professionals who work in this area, day in and day out, and make the meeting of two worlds work for the voters and for the really everybody involved. But as a way of introducing the subject, I'd like to make reference to my favorite set piece and my favorite musical, which is from the musical Oklahoma, and the piece entitled "The Farmer and the Cowman Should Be Friends." I use this oftentimes in my work because in the lab that I run, the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, we're dedicated toward bringing together researchers and election officials to try to improve elections by, among other things, bringing together two sets of people who oftentimes can be at loggerheads and don't quite know how to work with each other or what to make of each other. And with that in mind, I won't quite say it's at loggerheads, but in the process of redistricting and the use of data, there are a couple of actors involved who are really critical to drawing lines and administering the elections from the lines. And I'm going to make them, in this case, the mythical farmer and cowman, and I will call them the redistrictor and the election administrator. Usually the redistrictor is the state legislature, although actually in principle this could also be a local government as well. And to set up today's session, I'll begin by talking about the myth of the redistrictor and the election administrator. And this is the dance between the two sides of this data equation. So let's start with the redistrictors and their world and what they do with the election data in question. And to begin, I just note that in general, there's some exceptions, but in general, the atomic element here in drawing districts, so the census blocks, that is the preferred way of aggregating up to creating districts, ultimately in creating districts. From census blocks, we can build up into precincts by accumulating them. The Census Bureau version or term for this is voting tabulation districts, but let's call them precincts. And so we build up from these small units of geography into an intermediate unit of geography, and to draw the precincts that we want to draw. Now, the goal, of course, as we aggregate up from census blocks to precincts and ultimately to districts, is we want to avoid train wrecks. And that is to say, we want to avoid situations in which the data don't quite match up, communication between the redistrictor and the election administrator don't quite match, and those sorts of things. And so this myth is one not of a train wreck, but of how things would go well if they in fact go well. And that is to say, to return to the map, we could take the voting tabulation districts, and we, building from the voter tabulation districts or the precincts, we can further accumulate them into districts, into legislative districts. And this toy example that I've developed on the screen has 3 districts. Well, we know that between, say, one census to the other, people move into parts of a geography. Let's call it a state. They move in and out of the state. They move between parts of the state, and as a consequence of all this movement, at the next redistricting round, there are imbalances in the various districts that need to be accounted for. And so we can find, for instance, moving because of movements, say in this case, on net people leaving District 3 and on net moving into District 1, having to basically expand the geography of District 3 and shrink the geography of District 1. And as a consequence, well, that's just at the macro level, at a very general level. But in drawing lines, the thing that we care about, both the districtors and the election administrators, are not the lines per se, but rather the people who live within the various geographies that are being drawn. A social scientist would say manipulated, and that's not a bad word in the social sciences, although it's a bad word in the rest of the world usually. But there are people in these geographies that ultimately we need to worry about. And in this case that I've been talking about, on this little toy case, we have one precinct of voters who used to be in District 1 and now are in District 3. Now, imagine in this myth that I'm telling, this little story that I'm telling, that the redistrictors have now drawn new districts to reflect population movement over a census, and they give the definitions of the new districts over to the election administrator. Now, the election administrator now needs to worry, well, it's certainly the case that the people drawing districts care about the people in those districts. It's my experience that the individual people in those districts are abstractions or sometimes aggregations of particular demographic patterns, voting patterns, et cetera. But for the election administrator, the issue comes down to individuals who need to be assigned into the proper district. And so in this example here, again, we have a small snippet of precinct C that was moved from one district to the other. And we notice some things if you squint and look closely at the screen. We'll notice, for instance, that there's this fellow, Edward Rodriguez, who lives on 901 Main Street, and he was in old District 1 and has been moved to new District 3. And across the street, there's Michael McDonald, who was not moved. One of the details here, and one of the things that we hope happen, is that Edward Rodriguez, in fact, gets moved, but Michael McDonald does not inadvertently get moved. And in fact, because this is a happy ending to this story, these two individuals who live across the street, right on the district boundary, in fact, end up in the correct places. Now, why do they end up in the correct districts? Well, in part because the geographies in this case all lined up. The story I was telling was one where the census blocks were nested neatly within precincts, and the precincts were nested neatly within districts. And this is good. This happens in most states. It doesn't happen in all states, although we would hope it would. The other reason why this is a feel-good story is that both the redistrictor and the administrators had geographic information systems at their disposal, and GIS systems that allowed them to pinpoint individuals and to treat them with precision as the lines were first drawn, and then as the data handoff went from the redistrictors to the administrators. Now, on the redistrictor side, there are things that come up that sometimes can get in the way of a happy ending. And one of those things, for instance, I mean, there are a lot of them, but just as a for instance, let's imagine back in this case that in order to, this toy example, in order to draw the districts we wanted to draw and get them of equal population, this one precinct had too many people, and so we only wanted to take part of the population from that precinct. Well, to do that, we would, of course, get the dreaded split precinct, where there are some people who are in a precinct, and in much of the country, if you're voting in person, you're going to be going into a polling place, and some people will get one ballot, and some people will get another ballot. And so in this instance, we have to care not only about Mr. Rodriguez and Mr. McDonald, but we have to worry about all of these other voters, some of whom are going to be in a new district, some of whom are going to be in an old district, despite the fact that they are in different precincts. Again, if there are sophisticated tools like geographic information systems, these sorts of things can be worked out, but without those sophisticated tools, sometimes things can be problematic. And indeed, some of the problems come up when we don't have sophisticated tools are the problem that I call, the problem of redistricting with the shaky hand. That is to say, there are some places that still redistrict in the old-fashioned way with Sharpies and crayons and overlay and templates that overlay on maps. And the less sophisticated the tools available in drawing districts, the more likely it will be that there will be mistakes that are made, voters ending up in the wrong place. And indeed, these are the worries that show up when the handoff isn't handled correctly. Election officials can make mistakes depending on the handoff and the quality of the tools, and as a consequence, voters end up maybe getting the wrong ballots. Now, there's a statistic floating around in this world that suggests that as many as 10% of voters in recent elections may be, in fact, assigned to the wrong districts, the wrong precincts, as a consequence of imprecise redistricting and imprecise matching of where voters actually end up. There are other worries as well, maybe not as dramatic as these, but there are changes to geographies that happen between censuses. And in attention to these changes, even when the relevant actors have the most sophisticated equipment, can this can also end up to voters being in the wrong district. And this is where I'll end to suggest a real life example in a recent election from 2018. Many of y'all no doubt are familiar with this case, where the Washington Post has had a story of finding numerous misalignments related to the 28th House district election, which was a disputed election in Virginia. But they've discovered many other cases in Virginia where voters ended up being in the wrong place. So the topic today is a very critical one. It's a really important one. Certainly for someone like me who loves data, loves software and elections, that can get my blood really kind of going and pumped up and really excited. For other people, their eyes can roll in their heads and their eyelids can fall. But this is a very important topic if we want to ensure that voters get to vote on the right offices, if candidates and election officials want to make sure that they're actually communicating with the proper constituents. And if nothing else, if we want to keep the elections and election results out of the courts and to minimize recounts, contests, and those sorts of things. And so with those introductory remarks, I will turn it back over to Wendy.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. If any of you want to hear more of Charles's voice, he was on a webinar for us yesterday on moving to mostly mail elections, promises and challenges, and that archive is available. Shelley, you're up next, and in this situation, it's probably good to know that most of the people who are on the line are on the redistricting side of the equation. So you're helping to represent the election administrator's side. So with that, if you're ready, go for it.
Thank you, Wendy. So I work for the Maryland Department of Planning, and our role in redistricting is as the repository for the redistricting plans, not only the current ones, but also the historical plans. We're also the designated state agency coordinator for the Census Redistricting Program. So I'm heavily involved in not only the prep work for redistricting, but the redistricting process itself as far as getting everything available and out to the public. Let's flip to our slides. So what I'm going to go through is based on the 2010 redistricting cycle for us. And this process is going to change every 10 years. We are right now just getting into the 2020 cycle. So we have a lot of decisions to make, and we're basing them somewhat off of what we did in 2010. So Maryland does use a committee appointed by the governor to do the redistricting. And the committee provides myself and the Department of Planning and a few others with a block equivalency file to base the new plans on. The block equivalency file contains the block number for the current census and the district number that it's been assigned to. We'll use that information to create the maps and other data that we disseminate. So we tend to focus primarily on maps, geographic data, and demographic reports in a lot of common formats. We use our website, and we have an online application to show the maps, and of course there's press releases. A lot of the formats that we use are going to be Excel, text, and PDF formats. Some of the reports that we generate are going to be by district, and we do a lot of special requests. We try to do the district reports in several different formats. In this case, we're going to some of the basic ones we've used: population by race 18 and older, the county population by race broken up by district. I've got a few examples here, and at the end, I do have links to our website that you can actually go take a look at what we have available on our website for the 2010 redistricting. And we'll most likely do this very similar for the 2020 redistricting process. In addition to the reports that we provide in both PDF and Excel format, we also provide a lot of maps. We do obviously the statewide map, that's the basic map, and we do a lot of other maps. We'll do the new districts, and we'll do smaller geographies, so areas of interest is maybe some communities, maybe some municipalities. It ends up to be a lot of maps, and we do these both separately for the congressional and legislative. So depending on which one we're doing, we could generate well over 100 maps just to get started, just for our basic press releases. We create the maps with shapefiles. So I do GIS, and we create the maps with the block equivalency files we receive from the redistricting committee. And that information, in addition to being used to create maps, is also available on our website. We have on there the basic shapefile, which is the one GIS format. A lot of programs can read not only the Esri products, but a lot of the open source. We also provide a couple other formats, KML, JSON, and a couple others, to make sure that we get most of them covered so that anybody who's looking for geographic data can grab that. They can also grab the equivalency file that we make available. The equivalency file is made available in, again, usually the Excel and the text file formats for anyone who has or wants to do it themselves and grab the census geography at the block level and match the equivalency file to that data. And all these maps, they're all PDFs that everybody can download them, or if you want to take them home and print them, they're available. And then lastly, we also provide an online application or an interactive map. I've got a screenshot here of the legislative district map for 2010. We keep the map pretty basic, showing basically the base map and the districts that you can flip through depending on what area that you click on. Little screenshot here of Baltimore City and District 43. We've had this application standing since we did the redistricting in 2011 for the legislative districts. And it's usually one of the highest hit applications that we have available on our website. So the online applications are very helpful to a lot of people. And it's one of the things that we try to make it available as soon as the districts are available, so people can see what they're going to look like and understand if there's going to be changes, what districts they might end up in. So there we go. That's a very basic process. Obviously, it's going to change from year to year between redistricting cycles. So hopefully, we'll know what our 2020 process is going to look like soon. And I've got links here to not only our redistricting website, but also to the reports and the PDF maps, and to our interactive map that you can take a look at. All right, so that wraps that up. I'll just pass this back to Wendy.
Thank you, Shelley. It sounds to me as though a lot of the work that you do has to do with making this data available to the public. Do you know how long Maryland has been making this data available?
That's a good question. As far back as I can remember, and as far back as I can find our data going back to the 80s.
Wow.
So okay. Although it's very sparse, we could probably piece enough of it together.
Oh, great. I asked that because data availability is one of the questions that's coming up for this cycle. Well, and thank you very much for what you've shared with us. Tiffany, are you ready to go?
I am, yes.
Okay, you're on.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, thank you so much for having me today. I just want to give a little background. So I began working in elections in 1996 up in Bend, Oregon, and then relocated back home to Durango about 10 years later. So I've had experience doing redistricting in 2000 and 2010. And then, as with all county clerks, we are constantly having to review our Board of County Commissioner district lines and our precinct lines. So I do this pretty frequently. And today I just wanted to kind of give a local level perspective on how we have to handle it once all the data comes to us. So as far as, I'll start with pre-planning and the legal processes. So it's really, really critical that you understand your state and county requirements. And I did provide a handout that is available to all of you as a sample of what I do that I can distribute to my commissioners, to my representatives, and to the public, that really explains what I'm doing and why we're doing it. I work very, very closely with my county commissioners. And they are in Colorado, we ultimately, the county clerks prepare the maps once we get the data. We provide options. So we'll take our lines and maybe prepare 3 different types of maps and present those to our commissioners. And again, this is dependent on each county clerk and how they want to handle it. But I do a kickoff meeting prior to that. I always talk to the commissioners about any concerns they have. We also bring our planning department in because it's really critical for us to know what developments are coming, what the growth anticipation looks like, so that we can really, when we create those lines, it makes sense. So knowing what you can use to draw your lines. You know, once we get the House district and Senate district lines, those are firm. However, we need to be able to say, okay, now we have to draft the legal description that goes with that. So we're looking at, rivers, ditches, ridge lines, legal descriptions, parcel lines, all of that. But you need to, it is, I think, to my knowledge, it is different in each state on what we can and cannot use. So that's something that you need to make sure that you're understanding. Being prepared, this takes a long time. This is not something on the county side that we do very quickly. It does take us quite a bit of time to get prepared and to have enough people working on it. So I'm very fortunate in La Plata County that I have a very, very sophisticated GIS department. So I'm very fortunate. And we bring them in immediately as well, just because we work so closely together once we get all the census data and the redistricting information. How we receive our data, we in our county, I've always received it here in Colorado electronically. However, I remember the days of when I was in Oregon and getting the paper copies and doing exactly what Charles was referring to as far as laying them out with markers and crayons and colors, and it was rather challenging. So I'm really glad we've advanced. And it is challenging because it's every 10 years, so technology changes so much. It's not something that we do often. So that's why I do a lot of pre-education with my staff and working with GIS so that we know what all of our options are. And then when we receive the data, how do we analyze that? Obviously, when you have GIS, it makes a significant difference when they can overlay that information onto our current map and then offer suggestions and help on what we can, to make sure that the commissioner districts are correct as far as population. So again, in Colorado, we are building those districts based on population. However, our precincts are based on registered voters. So we're looking at 2 different data points. In 2017, I actually began working in preparation for the census and redistricting. And what we did is we redrew our current precinct lines in anticipation of growth. And again, working very closely with my planning department. And I believe most counties have their precinct lines, say, follow the municipal boundary lines and possibly school districts. which helps significantly when you're dealing with census data and the overall redistricting process. So we were able to submit very clean precinct lines when we submitted our shape files to the Census Bureau, and I think that will help us. I learned that lesson many years ago when we didn't do this, and it did seem much more cumbersome once we got the data. So on the implementation of it, who approves it in your particular county? So for us, it's, again, I submit to the commissioners options, and then they're the ones who ultimately make the decision of what map we're going to use and what boundary lines. Many meetings with the commissioners. Before I present to the public, I do show them my ideas and options and get feedback, and many times they do make some small adjustments. It can get rather political very quickly. So because in our county, the commissioners are elected at large, however, they must reside in the district that they're running for. So a line tweak here and there could potentially take a potential candidate in or out of a specific district. So that can get rather challenging sometimes. In my county, I know I've heard that across the state, but we work through it, and just like everybody does with redistricting. The voter registration database, again, we're very fortunate that we have a statewide voter registration database. So we work very closely with the Secretary of State's office during redistricting. It takes a lot of time to update the database. I think that is one of the areas that, as county clerks, we sometimes forget how long it takes. So, again, making sure that we have plenty of staff working on the project, and you have to be so careful not to make a mistake. So how I manage that is I actually do teams of 2 that work together to review the data and update the database, so we're ensuring that voter will get the correct ballot style. And I've been very fortunate that I haven't had errors. But again, we do that step, and then we also do proofreading by another team that's reviewing it. And, again, the amount of time it takes is rather challenging because we also have a lot of additional work to do, but I do make sure that we allocate a big block of time to take care of this. We also do a lot of voter outreach because it is important for our voters to know the adjustments that have been made. And the timing of that, I feel, can be right after you get done, whether it's a postcard or a notification of some sort. But in Colorado, it's a little unique because we are a mail ballot state. Voters aren't dependent upon going to a polling place in their particular precinct. However, they are by precinct when they go to caucus. So it's still important for them to know where their precinct lines are. And then, of course, it's very important for them to know for their Senate and House and Commissioner districts. So what I do is I involve the public throughout the entire process, and that's actually within the Colorado law. So we do quite a bit of public notices, public outreach. We do public hearings. I do a minimum of 3 throughout the community. I do a lot of town hall meetings, and just to make sure that I'm getting everybody's input. And obviously not everybody is, they're not real well attended, but it is important, and especially for those with their potentially going to run for office at some point. So that voter outreach, we do a postcard no matter what prior to the caucus, just again to explain where their precinct locations are at. But in mail ballot, it really isn't as big of a deal. It is a big deal for the campaigns, though, and so that's another thing. The parties get very involved when we're doing redistricting as well, and I include them and the League of Women Voters to make sure that I'm capturing all of their input. So I know I'm getting close on my time here, but I want to close in saying that the lessons I've learned during redistricting is to be prepared, educated on the laws, allocate a lot of time on the project, and communicate to your voters. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to when it's Q&A, taking any of your questions. And I think with that, Wendy, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, that's great. I appreciate that, Tiffany. Thank you very much. You kept mentioning all these other people who play a role. You mentioned the commissioners and the public and the planning department and the political parties. It seems like it's a coordinating function that you're doing there, that everybody's got a role to play.
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. Charles, I'm going to hand it back to you for a little bit of response to what you've learned from the state and local perspective.
Yes, thanks, Wendy, and thanks to Tiffany and Shelley for those really interesting set of comments. And I will just report that I was given permission to show Bart and Millhouse again while I'm making my final remarks. A number of things that come up here in these discussions that I find really interesting and would highlight. The first is that with the sophistication of the data and the widespread availability of data in most states, as was described here, and the widespread availability of GIS tools, that the role of the public, I think, is one that can't be discounted and is going to be growing probably in the 2020 census. That not only, I have to admit, I was playing with the Maryland tool at the end of Shelley's presentation, and it's a really neat interface for educating the public. And, there are other ways of educating. I mean, it's also possible to educate the public during the redistricting process increasingly. And, there are opportunities for state legislatures and county commissions to, make a series of more streamlined tools available to groups who might want to weigh in on choices to be made as district lines are drawn, and for the community to understand the trade-offs that are being made against different principles as authorities are drawing the lines. And so, the availability of data and the availability of software and the ubiquity now of web interfaces is, I think, after 2020, going to give rise to a lot more opportunities for the public to be involved, as well as an ability to draw together the different stakeholders, the traditional stakeholders of legislators and election officials and other officials as the process has been going on. Tiffany raised a point that I've seen raised in discussions of redistricting officials that doesn't get out in the public very much, but I think it's an important one for legislators to think about as they're drawing districts, and that is planning for the future. And that is to say that in most parts of the country, even when there is not rapid population growth, there is nonetheless population redistribution. But certainly in parts of the country where there is rapid growth, one can anticipate that the lines that are drawn, say, in 2021 may be inadequate by 2025 or 2026. And there may be needs for the creation of new precincts, needs for the creation, new precincts, and particularly in new ways to administer elections more efficiently. And so, again, with more, with the rise of the GIS tools, it's possible now for legislators to kind of think a little bit ahead to maybe the need to split a precinct mid-decade, and how that might look like moving forward, rather than having kind of a higgledy-piggledy process that might have to happen in the middle of the precinct. So planning ahead is a really important thing, and probably something that's underappreciated on the districting side, because the administration of the election down the road might not be high in the mind of the redistrictors. And the final thing I would just note, and I'm sure this has been discussed in the other webinars in this series. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to to follow them as closely as I would like to have. And that has to do with the issue of, or the fact that the census schedule for the 2020 census is being pushed back, and the important thing being that the ultimate data that are going to be released for redistricting has been pushed back basically 4 months into 2021, so that places that are having elections in odd numbered years, and there's a couple of states, of course, our friends in Virginia, I believe our friends in New Jersey, I could be wrong about that, but lots and lots and gobs of local elections are going to be occurring within really weeks of the release of the redistricting data, and certainly the primaries for some of these districts. And so the good news is that both Shelley and Tiffany emphasized pre-planning, getting stakeholders together, and being prepared for the redistricting. And the silver lining in all this cloud is that stakeholders in drawing districts may very well have more time to plan and prepare and get ready for the redistricting. But on the other side, there's going to be a wild scramble, not only to draw districts, but again, as the point was made in both presentations, there's the need, once the lines are drawn, for very careful attention to be made, making sure that voters are in the correct district so that they get the correct ballot, whether they pick it up in person or whether it gets mailed to them by the county. And so they're going to be real. There's always a new challenge in every election, even as the tools and the technology gets better. And certainly the one of timing this time around is going to throw a bit of a monkey wrench into things. And so, so with that, I think I will give it back to Wendy, who can manage us and manage the questions.
Well, I want to thank you, Charles, and thank you, Shelley, and thank you, Tiffany. That was really great, a nice framework for us to hold this. We do have some questions coming through, and if others have some questions, please put them in the box. I do want to say that NCSL has the Redistricting Law 2020 book available. I think you've heard me say that before. I won't say anything further about it. Let's go to the next slide, and then we'll take some questions. And I have a question for you, Tiffany. Could you give us a little bit more on the timing? When you receive your data, how long does it take you before you have to do your next step or get the county boundaries done? How long does this process take you?
Sure, thanks for the question. So if we receive the data in April, we'll begin in briefing with BOCC right away. So that would be no later than May. And then by June, I would be doing public open meetings to the public. July, we would be doing all the adjustments once we have the, if there's tweaks that we need to make. Usually it takes, several weeks to do all the public hearings. So by mid-July, I would have all of that done. By August, I would have the board officially adopt it, and then the work begins. Our deadline would be by September to be completely finished. So that's why I say it's not a process that just is so quick. Now again, this is when I was looking at my 2011 redistricting, when I was doing that one from the 2010 census, but yeah, it's a long process. I can't even, and just making sure you're doing all your notices correctly too. That's why I think it's important for everybody to know that it's not just the clerks doing this on their own. This is quite the public process. So
great.
Hopefully that answers the question.
And Tiffany, you have an answer on Colorado-specific timing in the chat box that might be helpful to you. For you, Charles, Representative Fortner says that in Illinois in the last cycle, there was a mismatch in a number of growing areas. The legislature provided block equivalency files, but those were based on blocks frozen in 2008. So by 2011, new subdivisions made it difficult to determine where the line should go on the current map. So can you just address the fact that maybe none of this is ever frozen, that the way people move and it's constantly in flux and it's hard to get it right at any given time?
Yes, and Thanks, Wendy, and thanks for the word from Illinois about the practicality of these issues. I try to make it a policy not to get out over to my skis too far in answering questions like this, being a relative neophyte in this area. But one of the things that I've discovered as I've gotten into the political geography is that the Census Bureau in fact does change the census geography between the censuses, and I don't know if this is exactly the problem that arose in Illinois, but if districts are defined in terms of census geography, there is there is the possibility that as the Census Bureau changes its geography, and if the users of GIS software aren't meticulous in updating data files and versions of software, et cetera, it is possible for people inadvertently to be not assigned the wrong district, but to begin to get ballots that are associated with the wrong voters. Michael McDonald, my colleague, who is really, I would say, one of the leading academic experts in this field, has called this administrative redistricting, because it happens without the legislative authority. It really isn't redistricting. It really is a matter of what can be a number of sources, including inattention to even data and software updates. And so it really bears paying attention to changes that are coming out of the Census Bureau, particularly in states that define the districts by census geography, rather than, I know in a number of states they draw the districts with census geography, but then redefine those districts back into observable features. So it kind of looks like old-fashioned redistricting, but that's really to lock down the intention of the legislature.
And I see the note from Representative Fortner saying that the problem was that the county was more up to date than the census was. And so I know that the Census Bureau is asking the states to provide up-to-date information and make suggestions all throughout the process, but at some point they lock them down, and then that's that. And I don't think we've got a fix for that problem yet. Shelley, I have a question for you, and it may not be the right question for you, so let's give it a try. And it comes from Doug Johnson, and he points out that in California, 2 times in a row, a Democratic nominee for a state Senate seat was incorrectly told he lived in the district. Do you have stories like that from Maryland where candidates are misplaced as well as voters are misplaced? Maybe misplaced isn't quite the right word, but in the wrong district.
I have not seen a candidate placed in the wrong district. With the 2010 redistricting cycle, we had a instance where somehow we had a legislative district line that was incorrectly placed, even though we knew it seemed odd. It was a retirement community, a large retirement community, and it happened to choose a block. It's one of those blocks that kind of slipped through the corrections we did with the Census Bureau before the census, and we had a pair of blocks that got split down the middle, split the retirement community, and then when we went through the redistricting process for the legislative districts, this retirement community was supposed to be all in one district, and somewhere along the line, the legislative district line got moved, and it was represented wrong. Now, although in the bill that was passed by the legislature, it was correct, somehow between the time the equivalency file that we got from the redistricting commission came to us, either it somehow got changed, we're not sure how, but we had that happen. That's in this case, because the bill was correct, it was a quick administrative fix on our side, and it was fine. As far as any major people in major instances where we had people in the wrong districts, not that I'm aware of. we don't typically deal with the database that the Board of Election uses to make sure that people addresses and people are in the correct districts. That might be a better question for them.
Excellent. It does sound to me as though the devil is in the details, or maybe God is in the details. Thomas Vaughn from Utah points out that an elected official discovered that he no longer lived in his district after he was elected. I believe this was a legislator. Yeah, it was a legislator, and had to be removed from office. So imagine that. You've run your campaign, you get elected, you have a party, and then oops, no can do. Charles, for you, what can legislators do to help smooth out this handoff from redistrictors to election officials? I bet you've got some suggestions on things you'd like to see.
Thanks for that question. And yes, I think that one of the things that, a big thing can be in helping, the redistricting authority and county offices with technological upgrades. Quite frankly, this is an area of rapidly changing technology, and access to all the tools of the trade is a really important thing. And so that's really where I would start, is with supporting whatever the Planning Commission, which undoubtedly, at the state level and the state capitals, pretty much everywhere, state authorities have the tools necessary to take advantage of the latest technology, but not so much at the county levels. And so I would start there with encouraging GIS adoption all the way down to county levels. Training, equipment purchases, et cetera. Also, I think my understanding of this world that there is a migration away from traditional meets and bounds to Census Bureau geographies, away from street segments, for instance, into GIS formats, and so encouraging a migration into new data standards as well, either through legislation or by encouraging the rewrite of regulations, would also be a valuable thing. So those are a couple of
Great. Great, I appreciate that. And Shelley and Tiffany, I'm going to ask you both the same question. If you could wave a magic wand and have redistrictors or whoever is handing you the data do one thing that would make your jobs easier, what would that be? And Tiffany, I'm going to call on you first, you might say.
Okay, it's a very good question. I think getting the data to us as timely as possible, and I loved what Charles just talked about as far as technology and upgrades and funding to support that, because I know there are many counties in Colorado that struggle with even having IT departments because they just don't have the funding or the size. So providing tools would be great that would allow us to do our jobs a little bit better, or at least the funding for us to obtain them.
Great, thank you. Shelley, how about you? I know you actually work quite directly with those redistrictors, so maybe you don't see it as you wish they would give you something differently. Maybe you see it as a we all the way along.
I think for us, it's just having some realistic expectations of the process. Although I've been through the redistricting process before, chances are whoever the governor appoints to the committee may not have. And I think that just for them to have some realistic expectations, as far as time-wise, roll out everything. GIS is fast, but it doesn't happen at a snap of the fingers. We need some time. And once we get the ball rolling, everything happens really quickly, so we can get this data out to the local boards, the local county offices, so that they can get started on their adjustment of their precincts or whatever to compensate or to deal with the new legislative and congressional districts. So that's, for me at least on my side, is the thing is just to have some realistic expectations.
I like that very much. I have one last question for everybody, and I'm going to tell you what the question is, then I'm going to make an announcement, and then I'm going to come back to you. The question is, if you learned something from somebody else today that you want to re-highlight, or if there's a takeaway you'd like to leave the audience with. So think about that. And then the announcement is, I don't know, we just decided yesterday that we are not going to be holding our Portland redistricting meeting in September. So for those of you who were looking ahead to the fall, that will be off the table. We are planning on the January meeting, and we now will have the opportunity to add one in probably April or May. And in fact, if any of you would like to suggest some southern cities that might be a good place to hold that last one in April or May, we are taking suggestions at this point. All right, Charles, one takeaway, one thing you learned.
Takeaway is that this is a team effort, and there's really no way around it. And the more people communicate, the more time they have to do the job, the better for everybody involved.
Great. That right to the point, and I think Tiffany's already doing it that way. Shelley, what's up for you?
For me, because I don't always see the local side of redistricting, how the counties and the municipalities deal with it, I think that was, for me, interesting to see that they probably put in as much work to it as what we do at the state level.
Boy, that is such a great takeaway, and I think that's the whole point here, is that most people on the redistricting side aren't thinking so much about what goes on after the fact. Tiffany, that gives you the last word.
Well, I would say my takeaway is obviously with what you guys have done with these sessions, communication is key. And I think it's amazing how each state is different. However, we're all in this together, and it is challenging. And something I learned from Shelley is how complex it is. And I'm not a GIS person. I don't understand all of that. So just seeing all the different things that Maryland is doing, it's awesome to see it all. And I think that just with this group right here working on this now, we're going to be in a much better position next year.
Wonderful. And with that, we have come to the end of our hour, and I thank you all for being with us. If you can stay on the line and do our quick survey, that would be great. But most of all, I want to thank Charles and Shelley and Tiffany. You've really given us a lot to think about today. And with that, I will just say stay safe and stay in touch. Thank you all.